GRIN as focus groups a natural place for young people to talk about the current state of politics in Mali and their perceptions about their future. So as I've highlighted what would be chapter 6 in this prospectus. And the presentation today is really going to look at the role of religion in politics, specifically the role that actors currently play, but also the role of the imagined role that they should be playing. All right, may I ask for the next slide? And thank you to Dr. Saar for doing the slide work here, great. So we're back just on that methodology slide, just emphasizing what I'm going to be talking about today. One slide back, I believe. Thanks. Again, is rooted in transcripts coming out of GRIN as organic focus groups. So for the political scientists, if we have them in the room, this approach is very reminiscent of Melissa Harris-Lacewell's work, or if you think of Kathy Kramer, Lisa Wedeen, where you're going and you're meeting people at a sort of natural places where people are already discussing politics, rather than hold on one second, it looks like that we have there might be an open window that's covering some of the PowerPoint, if it's possible to close it. I'm not sure. Again, sorry about these technical difficulties. It's my fault as my Zoom was not cooperating today. So if you could try, we could also try and Google Slides if that's easier. So if you go to open, we'll see what that looks like. And I think if you just accept edit PowerPoint for the web. Great. And then slideshow.
Is it showing?
Yes. So if you can just click, is the box still there, everyone? So maybe they're referring to perhaps the, it looks, thank you, Kalichi. So I think we're good to go. So if you could just pick slideshow and then from current slide. Yeah, great. Excellent. Okay. Yeah. So entering, thank you so much. These GRIN is organic focus groups, rather than bringing strangers together to talk about topics, actually meeting people where they're at and where they naturally talk about politics. I argue that GRIN are really great places to conduct focus groups because they're places of contentious debate where people are used to throwing out ideas, brainstorming, and even getting in fairly heated debates. So it's a place where I anticipate respondents will be rather forthcoming with their ideas about topics. That said, we have to read these data as coming from discussion in front of friends who you do have iterative discussions with day in and day out. So the transcripts today draw on 66 focus groups, conducting groups in Mopti Sevare, which is, if you look at the red box in the center of the country in Mali, very close to the current conflict. And then also in the capital of Bamako, which is, you can see the red square in a blue shaded area towards the bottom of the map, with 330 respondents. So, and many, many more participants, I would say almost 1,000 participants. So respondents, I just count the number of people who actually voice an opinion in focus groups, because we're coming in and talking to focus group or talking to GRIN as they have their regular meetings. A lot of people are just sort of spectating and not necessarily participating, letting co-members speak for them. But we do have a pretty good size pool of 330 respondents. And what, as I mentioned, what I'm really trying to do here is use focus groups in these GRIN as a lens to understand youth perceptions of Malian politics. If any of you have read Adrienne Masquier's excellent book on Fada in Niger, similar to her approach, but here I'm really looking at respondents' outward vision of how they see politics in the world around them. Next slide, please. we can go one back. I apologize for all it's skipping. Yep, great. So I'm conducting this research in Mali, which is a West African country, Muslim majority state, where, as I'll show you in a second, religious figures are pretty active in politics. There are no formal religious parties. Mali is technically a secular state. But I want to understand in this broader context, how do young people view the role of politics and what role should religious leaders play? On the bottom, you can see a picture of the beautiful mosque from Djenné, a World Heritage Site. Next slide. I'm going to argue that in response to this question of what role should, there we go, thank you. What role should Malian religious authorities play in politics? Essentially, young people see religious leaders as an enduring informal institution. And there are a couple of ways, there's some consensus around different areas where people think that, or young respondents think that religious leaders should be involved. So first, conceptualizing religious leaders as a fourth branch of government, so able to counsel, but also check the executive in order to abide to the will of the people. Second, religious leaders using their authority to legitimize, mobilize, and sensitize people, often collaborating with the government to help them achieve various initiatives. And third, and maybe most importantly, religious leaders as important mediators and peacemakers for broader society. So these 3 or 4 roles were repeated over and over, sort of consistently over the body of the focus group transcripts as areas of consensus for how religious leaders should be involved. And then the second argument that I want to forecast is that once we start talking about electoral politics, that is where there is a lot of debate. Should religious candidates run? Should they support other politicians to get into elected office? That's where we see much more contention, and I'd say much more split response. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Fantastic. So quick background on governance in Mali. As I mentioned, Mali is a Muslim majority country in West Africa. To our right, there's a picture of Sundiata Keita. Many of you might have heard of the legacy of the Malian Empire. Mali is very well known for having strong systems of pre-colonial governance and many enduring legacies that come out of centuries-old traditions, including Senenkuya or Kuznaj. This is a practice that links people with different last names from other ethnic groups to create a conflict mitigation mechanism. There's a really cool article by Dunning and Harrison that looks at voters who are presented with candidates who are essentially from the same ethnic group or who share Kuznaj bonds, and show essentially that people are as attracted, or they want to vote for cousin candidates as much as they want to vote for those with shared ethnicity. So Mali has a very diverse population. It achieved independence from France in 1960. It's relatively poor. If you look at the human development indicators, for instance, Mali is consistently in the bottom quintile. It's a landlocked country, which creates challenges for its economy. It transitioned to multi-party elections in 1992 following a coup d'etat. That from 1992 on, we've observed freedom of association, increasing freedoms of association, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. In addition, there have been 2 executive alternations of power, something that political scientists look for as a measure of democratization. But despite sort of all this progress in terms of governance, there are also some concerns that had plagued sort of the Malian regime, including 3 rebellions that had happened from 1960 or between 1960 and 2012. And a characteristic that we see in many regimes across the world, which is an imbalance of power, such that the executive really had much more power than the legislature or the judicial branch. Next slide, please. For those of you who, I think it's one before that. Great, thank you. For those of you who are not as familiar with Mali, the Mali that you might have seen in the news lately is the Mali of crisis. And so I thought I should quickly touch on sort of the events since 2012. So in 2012, there's an insurgency in the north of the country, led by both Tuareg independence groups, but also aligned with jihadist groups. And so in response to the president's mismanagement of the burgeoning rebellion, there's a coup d'etat in the capital of Bamako, which removes the president a couple months before what would be a scheduled election and Mali's third alternative or executive alternation of power. So this happens, creates a power vacuum essentially, and groups are able to take regional capitals in the north of the country, displacing almost 500,000 people. And we saw many civil servants flee their posts. So a loss of government presence in almost territorially, what would be 2/3 of the country. So in 2013, there's a French intervention that pushes groups out of most of Mali's territory and paves the way for 2013 elections in which President Ibeka is elected with unprecedented popular turnout. 2015, there's the Algiers Accord, a peace treaty that's signed by some groups. But this is also a period where we observe a fragmentation and a proliferation of different types of insurgent, jihadist, and militia groups as people seek to protect territory. 2016 forward, I've flagged as just increases in intercommunal conflict, but also school closings due to both sort of jihadists actively shutting down schools, but also to school strikes. So negotiations between teachers and the government. And finally, popular sort of dissatisfaction with the regime and the regime's handling the security crisis leads to a 2022 coup, a nonviolent coup, in which Ibeka steps down and a new junta takes power. So the map on the right of the screen, that's was done by the Institute for Security Studies, fantastic policy group out of Dakar. And it shows the geographic breadth and of jihadist activity in 2019. And so this has drawn the attention of many policymakers and observers outside of Mali. But as we go to the next slide, what I'd like to do is actually bring our attention, focus our attention on the more mundane ways that Islam plays a role and almost has always played a role in governance and service provision in Mali. So if you look at previous rulers and kingdoms in Mali, there's frequent negotiation or collaboration with religious leaders, and Islam plays a central role in many polities. In addition, if you look at Quranic schooling, this predates any kind of French schooling by centuries. And in the last 50 years, there's been a huge growth in modern Arabic language schools, religious schools, madrasas. So we see sort of Islamic and religious welfare services and even clientelist networks happening parallel to those provided by the state. We see traditional and religious authorities continuing to play central roles administering justice in Mali. If we looked at Michigan State's Afrobarometer, we'd see that respondents are very, very trusting of traditional leaders and in fact would like them to have a greater role in society. So the findings I'm going to show are along those lines. Finally, as I'll show in the next slide, religious leaders continue to negotiate with and counsel politicians. So next. And so here I just wanted to offer some contemporary examples of where we've seen religious groups have active roles in contemporary policy or politics. So the first, many of you might have heard of family code protests in 2019, and essentially there was an attempt to reform family code or family law in Mali with a bunch, I want to say hundreds of different provisions that did things like create a minimum age of marriage, require people to have civil instead of just religious marriages, but also looked at inheritance, rules related to inheritance. And so even though the National Assembly votes nearly unanimously to accept this bill, family code, there's massive outpouring into the streets, protest mobilization by various religious groups that essentially lead the president to pull back the code and a massive overhaul and renegotiation of the content of the code, working in tandem with religious leaders. We've seen religious leaders become involved, or religious movements become involved backing candidates, particularly Ibeka's nomination or election in 2013. There was a big religious coalition or movement called Sabati behind him. And finally, looking at the 2020 protest, massive groups of coalition of civil society coming together in the lead up to the coup, we had religious leaders at the front lines of leading some of those protests, at least one. Next slide, please. So given that we see, so we're in a secular state, but we see a lot of involvement of religious authority in especially extra institutional forms of engagement in governance and politics, I thought it would be really important to ask Malian youth what they view the appropriate role of religious leaders in politics moving forward. So next slide, please. So I think the slide just prior. Thank you, Lisa. So this is, again, to go back to the data collection strategy, we're interviewing 66 groups, 330 respondents in Mopti, Sevare, and Bamako. They're mostly men between the ages of 18 to 45. So if you are asking yourselves questions of whose voices are these, who is this representative of, this is a mostly male sample, and this is a youth sample in urban areas. These grinw were selected through snowball samples, working with teams of enumerators. They, as I mentioned before, take place in an organic environment where people are participating in focus group with other co-members of their own grinw. And I really liked focus groups as a methodology for this because of the way that they invite respondents to sort of to argue or debate or leave open space to talk about contentious questions. So I think that this is made even better or more salient by the fact that these conversations are happening in spaces where that kind of spirited engagement takes place. If you think of different, so in all these focus groups, we have I had two research assistants, one lead research assistant, and then a secondary research assistant. One was leading the questions, and then the other was taking notes, but also recording everything in local language. After the focus groups were recorded in local language, they were translated and transcribed into French by two different research assistants in order to confirm intercoder reliability. And finally, I then read through all the transcripts and did a manual coding of the themes coming out of them. Next slide, please. So these are the types of questions that we are asking. What role should religious leaders play in the political system? Does religion impact your attitudes towards politics? You can sort of see the slate of questions. And again, I'd reference that this is fairly passive intervention by the focus group leader. So respondents were free to sort of skip the questions they didn't want to answer or pick up on the questions they thought were important. Again, in a fairly sensitive political context, we didn't want to force anyone to answer anything that they weren't comfortable with. So people could answer as they felt comfortable. Next question, please. So the first series of themes that I want to emphasize are the themes where we had broad consensus, and this is about religious leaders working as an informal fourth branch of government. So first, I want to highlight some quotes related to religion as a check on government power. So if you can go back, Lisa. Thank you. So a lot of the respondents prefaced this with an understanding that there's an imbalance of power, the legislative branch and the judiciary aren't able to check the executive. So they need another group to step in and hold the executive accountable to the will of the people. And they felt that religious leaders could use their legitimacy, use their authority to call out and change the direction of politicians in order to really ascribe to the will of the Malian people. So you see in this quote, right, that religious leaders have a duty and obligation to speak up to leaders and say what religion requires of them. Religion has an obligation to speak the word of God so that leaders can work for their people. So we see both religious themes in here, but also a populist message of listening to the will of the people and what they want. Next slide, please. So similar to religious leaders stepping in to check government when they get out of line or they take a path that's outside of what the Malian people would want. Another similar function noted for religious leaders is counseling politicians. So telling them how they should proceed. And one theme that came up over and over again is the importance of religious leaders keeping politicians being accountable, but also preventing corruption. So this is consistent with a lot of work from other regions. So scholars like Melanie Kamenet and Pauline Jones-Lung, sorry, let me turn off this phone, it keeps calling me. They've they've highlighted what they call an Islamist political advantage in the context of elections, where Islamic political parties can call on can use or leverage their spiritual authority to have greater legitimacy on issues like tackling corruption. So here you see, if we no longer trust politicians these days, it's simply because they are not of moral character. And they see that in response to religious leaders, right? Or they juxtapose this to religious leaders who are pure or have not been tainted by politics. And since they have accountability to God, right, they're in a position to limit corruption. So next slide, please. So here are just some other examples of why people felt that religious leaders should be involved in regularly counseling and advising politicians. Some, again, invoked the role that religious leaders had played in the pre-colonial period as advisors to government. So here we have a respondent, Mopti, explaining that religion must accompany politics to guide it and ensure it's in the best interest of the population. Again, ensuring that there's overlap between what government's doing and the will of the people. And in the second quote, we say, in regard to government offices where corruption can exist, the government can appoint a religious commission to reform and moralize them. So here's a proposal for even greater institutionalized involvement of religious leaders in order to limit corruption. Otherwise, if you no longer see trust in politicians these days, it's simply because they're not of moral character. Next slide, please. So another way for religious authorities to collaborate with government that was recognized and proposed moving forward is in order to help sensitize, mobilize, and legitimize government initiatives. So here we see an example of religious leaders conveying public health messages in mosques in order to get people to participate in vaccine campaigns. Next slide, please. But we can, there were other examples that were given, such as calling people back down from the streets, essentially to calm people down. In the case that there was a massive uprising, religious leaders had the tone and the authority in order to bring people back into their homes. So the final area through which there was consensus was the importance of religious leaders in maintaining social cohesion. So here we start to see boundaries emerge, right? And as respondents describe really what religious leaders should be doing, this respondent from Bamako says the role of religious leaders should be limited to consolidating relationships between people and advising people in the face of different orientations in political life. Otherwise, this respondent does not want religious leaders involved in politics. They want to make sure that they stay squarely in a camp of religion and not of politics. Next question, or next slide, please. Thanks. Finally, related to this, when people were talking about the importance of religious leaders maintaining social cohesion, there was also a strong underlying theme of religious tolerance and cohabitation, that while people were not comfortable with a truly secular orientation that prevents an interface between religion and the state, or an embrace of religion by the state, they wanted to be able to ensure that people had freedoms to practice the religion that they wanted. So here they give the example, this respondent talks about a hypothetical, very religious president who can manage power within the norms or the understanding of his religion, but also allow others to practice their own faith. Next question, or next slide, please. So finally, there's a real shift when we come and talk about electoral politics. So the categories that I just highlighted, those 4 categories of checking the government, advising politicians, of legitimizing and sensitizing in collaboration with government authorities, and then finally working as mediators or as conduits or nodes of social cohesion. That type of consensus around those themes is really different than when we enter the terrain of electoral politics. Here's where we in the transcripts see a lot of very contentious debate about what role religious leaders should play. And I think in order to understand or to situate some of these comments, I think it's important to look into Malian political culture a bit. And I want to emphasize a couple things that you might have already been able to read through the lines sort of in the lead up with the previous quotes, but to stress that in the Malian political system, there's a lot of skepticism about the period of electoral campaigns that many respondents in other work have referred to me have referred to when talking to me as kalatawati, so literally meaning like the voting time. This is the time when politicians come out and actually are seen and heard rather than hiding sort of in their offices in Bamako. This is when electoral campaigns are happening, where there's sort of more of a competitive spirit of one man, one vote, compared to a more deliberative, consensus-based form of governance that is more common sort of in village or even sort of quartier life. So kalatawati has a very negative stigma as it's related to this catchphrase that you hear everywhere, sort of in songs on the street, that is politiki mai. So politiki, again, being a specific word designated for electoral competition and campaigns, rather than the vast Bamana vocabulary that's used to refer to governance, right? Politiki is about elections and campaigns. So when we talk about politiki and kalatawati, it's almost as if this is compartmentalized as a separate type of, and important, again, if you look at the Afrobarometer data, you'll see that Malian respondents again and again say that electoral democracy is the best form of governance for their society. But at the same time, here we see a real skepticism about the actual practice. So what we'll see in the next slides are both sort of pros and cons arguments for whether or not there should be religious candidates or whether or not religious leaders should offer directives to vote. And going through the data, I saw a lot of references to people voting for Ibeka in 2013 because a religious leader had suggested that that was the right thing to do. So religious leaders as credible heuristics. Elisa, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So some of the arguments for why you'd want a religious leader engaged in electoral politics is their credibility, right? They have a large role to play in our social life. Everyone needs to have a leader, so our religious leaders are our guides. So talking about the credibility, these people are great sort of leaders and heuristics as citizens are trying to distinguish and differentiate between different candidates and platforms. The second respondent gives an example of two very different religious leaders and how they participate in politics. Because they're well known, people appreciate them. And if they don't understand, or if outsiders don't really understand, is that when someone is a guide, they're listened to, and in parentheses, I'd say in most domains, many domains, and followed by a lot of people. And so next slide. So we can contrast that with the critique, and I'd say there were two different types of critiques that came up in terms of reasons why you would not want religious leaders either supporting candidates or even more extreme, running themselves as candidates. And the first being that the participation in electoral realm could somehow damage or taint the credibility and legitimacy of religious leaders, that it would detract from the religious purpose, which is more important. So worried, this respondent gives examples of politicians lying, and then concern that somehow those lies would invade the area that's governed by religious leaders, the word of God being sacred. And so the second critique is a bit different, and this is representative of another body of critique that essentially is saying that if religious leaders step outside their role, this could really be something that generates conflict, and that would defy their role as mediators and consensus creators. So essentially, by participating in some kind of partisan exercise, this would exclude religious leaders from being able to play the role of sort of bringing the social fabric of Mali together. A third critique that I don't have up here right now, but I'll just mention by a minority of candidates, citizens, but it did still come up a couple of times, is the concern that given the preponderance of power of many of these religious leaders, that this could threaten sort of one man, one vote, that a citizen casting his ballot would not be doing so based on his own volition, but would be in fact reflecting on these directives from someone with a disproportionate amount of power. Next slide. Okay, so as we move to the findings, just to recap, right? So consensus around a popular understanding of Islamic leaders as a fourth branch of government. I tried to highlight 4 different ways that religious leaders were seen as already institutionalized and perhaps maybe should be more institutionalized in terms of the social understanding. And so that is checking government in order to represent the will of the people, counseling religious political leaders. So again, they were in line with the wishes of the population, helping to legitimize good government initiatives, and finally, generating social cohesion. And we can contrast that with a really contentious debate about when and how and if religious leaders should be involved in electoral politics. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So what I think this chapter is doing, which again is brand new, so I'm very excited to hear any feedback that you all have. I mean, one thing I think that comes out of this, which for me, at least in the vein of political science, is really interesting, is how it stresses the importance of understanding actors outside of formal democratic institutions or formal institutions that contribute to popular understandings of checks and balances. So here we've seen evidence of how citizens understand these very informal institutions to help balance presidentialism. But it also then raises really interesting questions about who plays a role of a fourth branch of government, whether it's a traditional leader, religious leader, the armed forces, who has the power to sanction the president, and what does that mean then for the durability of formal institutions moving forward? Second, I think it underscores the way that even in a country where formal parties, formal Islamic parties are absent, if you're just looking sort of towards formal institutions to try to understand the role of religion in politics, that would totally underrepresent the role that Islamic leaders play. So as I mentioned earlier, it's consistent really with research that shows how Islamic actors are viewed as less corruptible and more honest, and this can play into some type of political advantage. Finally, it also shows, at least in the Malian context, this very clear demarcation of electoral politics and then other types of governance more broadly. Next slide, if there is one. So again, I think that this work opens up some pretty interesting questions for future research, both in the Malian context, but more broadly. I'd say more broadly, it makes me at least think about how do we understand and study regimes that are governed by this portfolio of both formal and informal institutions and actors. Secondly, I was speaking to a Malian colleague the other day, and he raised this, which I think is really important. How does the content of religious leaders thinking about political life influence citizens' understandings of governance and good governance? And then finally, in the Malian case, I think given the diversity of religious actors, including jihadist models of governance that are explicitly rejecting the state, how do the confluence of all these actors coming together shape popular understandings of religion and governance moving forward, knowing at least what we've seen from this presentation today, that there is some receptiveness to religious participation in politics, but a real stress on things like social cohesion and tolerance and representing the will of the people. And so with that, I will stop. I apologize again for the technical difficulties. I'm on a loaner laptop that's creating some problems, but I thank you both Professor Saar and Lisa for your heroic efforts there in aiding me with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Bleck. We did it with some challenges, but it worked. Thank you so much. Wonderful. So if you have questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A section, or you can raise your hand. And I think we have somebody. Susan, I will let Susan talk. Go ahead, Susan.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It's really a pleasure to see such thoughtful qualitative research presented at our Iron Africa seminar. You know, reflexivity is a really central aspect of conducting qualitative work. And I wonder if you could just comment on your presence in these groups and how that affected your data collection and your findings.
Sure. And Professor Saar, would you like me to take a queue of questions, or would you like me to respond as they come up?
Yeah, you can respond as they come up.
Okay.
In the Q&A too, we can.
Great. Okay, Susan, thank you so much for that question. So we had something like 66 focus groups, as I mentioned. So I actually only went to the first 8. And so I should preface that again, in the context of this project, there's other work where we're doing things like individual surveys, trust games, public goods games, ethnographic work sitting in grinw. But for this focus group part, I attended the first 8 with my research assistants, And while I can understand Bamana, I'm not fluent, but I could sit and understand what was being said. I'm not as good as my research assistants are in posing the questions, so I was not leading discussion. At times I'd ask a couple follow-up questions. Two things struck me. I mean, on one hand, I think many people weren't necessarily knowing that I understand anything that's being said, but the second thing is that I was very aware that my presence could shift the discussion, especially around governance, right? And that people are primed to think of cues of good governance and how, for instance, the West might view the appropriate role of religion in politics. So I ultimately decided after 8 to remove myself from the group, but had spent a long time. The 2 research assistants, I should give them a shout out, Yusuf Konde and Mamadou Guindo, who are my leaders in Bamako and Sevare. I've been working with them for more than, at that point, more than 5 years on different projects. So I really felt like they, we had a really good collaborative relationship where I felt good about decentralizing and handing this off to them, and that they would challenge me and push back if they thought design wasn't working or it was appropriate. But also on this grinw project, they'd been working on it for a full year before we launched into the qualitative work. So I felt like they had a very good sense of what we were trying to get with this data. So the research assistants really had the lead on the majority of these, in part because of that, the effect, my positionality doesn't allow me, right? I'm not a member of a grinw in real life. So it changes the dynamics of the discussion in such a way that I thought it would be more advantageous to have the research assistants lead the groups. And then of course we had the recording that we had consent on multiple levels at the grinw and then individuals in the group that was recorded. And so I'm really working from the transcriptions rather than observations in these groups.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. I see Danson has a question on the side. I don't know if you want to voice it or you want me to read it from the Q&A.
You can read it.
Okay, all kinds of multimedia here. This is good. Okay, so it's a very good question. Thank you for your insightful talk. How has Mali managed to maintain the status of a secular state even when religious leaders are very active in the country's politics? I guess France's influence in the country partly explains this, but there could be several other factors. Great question. Yes, I'd say that the French presence and certainly the French influence in creating the Constitution initially played a role. But I'd also say that there's a political class, the classe politique, who's very wedded to a certain, to I think the secular version of Malian democracy. I think there are also political dynamics, right? The fact that we see, if you ask most Malians, I don't know if there are any on the chat that want to jump in, but like who's more powerful, who's better able to mobilize a crowd into the streets or to fill up a stadium? Religious leaders and their networks are far more politically expedient or sort of able to mobilize and get the word out vis-a-vis political parties. Political parties in Mali historically have been pretty weak. So I'm just speculating here. I don't have data on this. Umar Tiam has his hand up. So I don't know if that's in reference to this response, but I would definitely open others to have more expertise here in trying to explain this tension between what is a very active religious involvement and then this sort of secular nature of the state. I'll just, in closing, before I pass things off, say that unlike other countries, there hasn't to date been a very, very explicitly active debate about making Mali Islamic, but certainly there are actors in the north of the country that is number one objective. Ali and other jihadist actors want Mali to be an Islamic state. Umar?
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I appreciate a lot your information you brought out here. So since I'm from Senegal next to Mali on the east side, I would like to focus again on the religious participation of those voices in Mali in reference to what we have here in Senegal or in my country. So it's like they know not in a religious party, nor in a political party, but they have their own voices to lead or to influence the youth, like you say. So my question is, if you have now to make a classification between the powers that rules the country, like Mali, into political and not political or informal parties? Would you just classify those religious leaders or voices among the informal or political? Because in a sense, they have a discourse that talk or responds to the politicians, or to give the politicians a guideline to follow according to what they have in expectation from their people or followers. So there is a question I can just, put in a context like in Senegal, where you have religious leaders who are leading and influencing the politician at the same time without being in political parties. So in a word, how could you just, frame that kind of influence from the religious leaders without being in political parties? What would be your answer to that? How could you define that in a way that you can say the political parties are not so strong enough to let out the religious voices or leaders? Thank you.
Thank you, Umar. And I think you're hitting at exactly what I'm grappling with, right? And I'd love to, at some point, I wish we were in person, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on Senegal, where there's even greater institutionalization. I think of some of these practices and sort of religious leaders as conduits or ways to pass up political messages. You know, on one hand, I'm calling these groups this informal, but on the other hand, right, if presidential candidates have to go visit every religious leader as part of campaign practice, on some level, this is highly institutionalized, and perhaps wades into the world of formal. So I am, grappling with, without being political parties, if you're a movement or a coalition, and you're still sort of doing the work of parties in terms of bringing advocacy for an interest group or a group of people into political platforms or into the political space. How do we understand that? So that's something I'm grappling with and trying to figure out. I do think, and I would be interested in your thoughts or anybody else's thoughts, I do think that, at least in Mali, my working hypothesis, and this, I think we observe some folks would make like great candidates, just if you look at the level of support, but there's a real fear of fully stepping into the electoral space. I think for a lot of the reasons, sort of popular sentiment appears to be quite split on that. But I think that there's something about people staying on the sidelines and yet having a very strong voice, very strong influence without being formal political parties. I think somewhere in that space, religious leaders are able to maintain credibility and legitimacy that I don't know. I don't know the counterfactual, but I feel like would be more compromised if they were to explicitly go all in, sort of as political parties or candidates. But I would love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, thank you.
Michael?
Well, thank you so much, Jaimie. I actually had a question that was quite similar to Omar, but I think I can maybe extend on that to some extent as well. So if you think about the political leaders, so, you know, I'm even thinking about the American example, which seems to have some similarities, but can you see that in any way that the religious leaders try to move the needle on public opinion in terms of how they may engage in electoral politics? So if they do realize that there is this sort of hesitation for them to be directly involved in electoral politics, could there be a way to try to reshape the narrative of what that sort of intervention would look like and sort of increase the acceptance of their place in politics?
Oh, in terms of the interface with citizens?
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think the question, or I'd put it, I'd say, if we look at strategies of religious elites who have various sort of policy objectives or want to represent their constituencies in a certain way, they have a bunch of different tactics for doing so, right? And so formal politics is only one route to take. There's also sort of the social projects of moralizing and sort of changing social practice. There's another basket that we've seen a lot of, which is contentious politics, whether it's through protests in the street or more discrete types of lobbying and backroom deals with political elites. But I think because there's a range of different tactics, I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see moving forward whether there's a push for greater acceptance or some kind of positioning such that you could have a successful sort of Islamic party that's infused with sort of populist ideas in Mali. I mean, so constitutionally, Islamic parties, I believe, are still not allowed, but we've seen, right, that parties can be very creative in how they run, but still run with a very sort of religious platform. When Sabati was asking for candidates that they were going to back, I mean, one of the initial discourses was, well, we want somebody that will ascribe to these conditions. So laying out a platform in that way. But I do think, as I alluded to at the end of the talk, that the events in the North and the fact that we have certain actors taking very strong positions vis-a-vis the state, the secular state, I would anticipate that that will shape the nature of discourse in the center and south as well. So this focus group data is from 2015. And so 6 years later, I think Mali's in a bit of a different political space, and these are open questions.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, Jeff, go ahead.
Hey, Jaimie. This is Jeff Conroy-Kratz. Thanks for giving a really great presentation. I guess I'm probably going to ask you kind of an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. Knowing that the participants in these focus groups were male, what do you know based on like the research for this broader project, or your own general sentiment about Mali? To what extent are the sort of attitudes about these religious figures influence in the formal political realm? To what extent do you think they differ on the basis of gender? Do women largely hold similar kinds of attitudes, different kinds of attitudes? Does it depend on other kinds of factors? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so one of the downsides of my project by focusing on these groups, our sample, so when we look at survey data and all this, our sample is disproportionately male. So we do have women in some of these groups, but the majority, I think 70+% are either all male or partially male. There are more female participants in our sample in the regional capital of Mopti and Sevare. But yes, I think you're correct. You'll be correct in characterizing my presentation, and I tried to sort of throw an asterisk on youth views because I'm really talking about male youth views in these two urban areas. So yeah, that raises a lot of questions about what women think. And so I can't speak to my own data on this, but I guess I'd offer two thoughts drawing from just one observation. I was in Mali during the family code protests in 2009. Doing my dissertation work. And, if you looked who was on the streets, there were as many women as men who were out protesting against this code that was largely seen as a top-down political directive that didn't consult, with enough of religious leaders or the constituencies. And a sticking point there was really around sort of religious versus civil marriage. And so that at the time, there was a big debate. At the same time, there was a big lobby, right? The reason the family code, sort of the revisions to the text came to the fore in the first place is because there was a coalition of women's associations, human rights group or women's rights groups that lobbied for this legislation, particularly in order to help with inheritance rights for children born out of wedlock. That was one major issue, and also increasing there was an attempt to increase the minimum age of marriage, I think, to 18, which failed and was renegotiated. But so there was a strong lobby from the biggest women's associations in Mali to get this passed, and I believe they were still fighting it in appeals courts, years later, and felt like they had been sidelined in a way by the outpouring in the streets. So that is just to say, I think there's a lot of diversity depending on who you talk to. And then we see that in other folks' work. Alice Kang's awesome book on sort of the debate between women's associations on both sides of a lot of these issues of like how involved religious actors are or how much you're leaning on the secular state. So I'd stop in saying I think there's a lot of diversity of opinion. Yes, okay. And I have a question from Danson. So it says, yes, one more question. Since your research assistants were very involved in my research as people who speak Bambara better than I do, is it possible for them to be given the status of co-researchers instead of mere research assistants? What would it take for them to be co-authors on the paper? I'm asking this question out of ignorance on how field work is done. I'm from literary studies. This is a great question. And I think a lot of us who do field intensive work with big teams that are grappling with, in part because I think the disciplinary standards are really different, but they're also evolving. They're really changing. So something that I use as a barometer, a threshold for co-authorship is actual writing of the paper, writing up on the paper. You know, this is something that I continue to think about. So this project and the broader project, so not what I presented today, but on the broader quantitative project, I have 4 or 3 other co-authors. But none of the co-authors, one's a graduate student, Lassir Osar, who's finishing up his economics PhD, but none of the Malian research assistants, are co-authors on the paper. So I agree that this is something that we all need to think about, particularly when we think about sort of these questions of knowledge and local knowledge and whose knowledge is worth more. I would just, I guess, say that if I was going to move forward and do a paper with, for instance, Yusuf, who I've collaborated with on lots of different projects, I would want the co-author involved sort of from the ground up on the theorization and the design, and also the write-up and not just data collection. But I know that it varies in different fields. And this is definitely something that I think we all need to continue. I'm glad you raised the question. It's something that I'm thinking about, but yeah, I think it's something that we need to keep talking about moving forward.
Other questions or comments?
Okay, so I have another comment in the chat from Umar Tiam. Thanks for the information. My question is the grinw focus group the only open and committed one to political issues in Mali? How about social networks and palaver tree clubs? Yeah, no, I think in Mali, you know, if you went to almost any, a grinw is sort of set up around this idea of drinking tea, sharing information, sharing worries, sharing vulnerabilities, sharing current events, like new information. So you're certainly right in that this is a place where people share information. That's why one of the main reasons that people come. So in a way, maybe this is a more politically astute, politically aware, politically alive space. But I'd say 2 things. One, I think that in other groups, I mean, Mali, the political culture, people are very politically knowledgeable. I've been blown away by sort of people's knowledge, not just of Malian politics, but politics in the US. I can't imagine sort of like that my fellow Americans would know anything at all about sort of even, you know, Canadian politics if you ask. So the fact that Malian respondents can often sort of oscillate in reference points between French politics, American politics. I think that typically the political culture is one that people seek to acquire knowledge to understand the political terrain. 2, I'd say that while grinw are maybe more politicized, I think these other types of places where people are coming together, if we're talking about youth, people are really concerned about the future of their country, and thus they're talking about things like governance. They're talking about things like religious leaders. So I do think that if I were to sit in on different types of groups, you'd see some other debate, maybe not quite as really focused on politics the way that we see it in grinw, but at the same time, I also think something like, so in our survey, we find about 60% of males, 18 to 45, they participate in grinw. So this isn't, you know, these aren't Most young men 18 to 45, right, in Malian society are participating in these, at least in urban centers. So I think it's a pretty good proxy for maybe how people are talking about this. Certainly in these informal spaces, not necessarily at home, which would be much more sort of hierarchical, but perhaps, right, in courtyards, under trees, in other places. Other questions? So Danson has a follow-up about this question of co-authorship. And if you send me your email, Danson, I can send you some, at least from the political science, where I think we're at in terms of thinking about this idea. But I invite Jeff or Michael or other political science in the room, sort of where we're at, trying to think about like, what are the thresholds for co-authorship versus research assistance? Yeah, I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts, because yeah, I think this is an evolving and definitely important topic.
Well, I think that was all. Thank you so very much for a very interesting presentation. We appreciate your coming and sharing with us. And thank you everybody for attending and asking questions. We're gonna take a 2-week pause to attend ASA conference and Thanksgiving, but we'll be back on December 2nd for another Eye on Africa. Thank you again, Professor Bleck.
Thank you all for inviting me and for your great questions.